This is Unstructured.
Hey everybody, today I'm super excited. You all know by now that I'm very interested in the workings of influence, the mind, people, how they react to others, and how we can learn from other people. And this can be both good, but it can also be bad. And I think it's really important to cover both sides of these. So today I'm really fortunate enough to have on an FBI forensic analyst, a profiler, and most intriguingly, a forensic linguist, James R. Fitzgerald. How are you doing today, Jim?
I'm doing fine, Eric. Thanks for having me on your show.
Hey, I'm super excited to have you here. You've got such a storied career, and I really like your pattern. From what I understand, you started out all the way from being a store detective, which I'm not going to say is like a security guard plus. I don't know how you describe it, and hopefully you will. And all the way through being a beat cop to being a detective to being FBI and on and on. And you've written all this out in 3 books with a 4th one coming. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I decided to give them one title. I've always, as a young boy, I fell in love with Jules Verne and a few of his books, but certainly including A Journey to the Center of the Earth. And there was a 1969 song by the Amboy Dukes called A Journey to the Center of the Mind. No, I'm sorry. No. Here's the linguist in me. No indefinite article on the front. So my title of my books it's a distinct and unique title in that regard, A Journey to the Center of the Mind, all 3 of them, soon to be 4. But each one has a subtitle. The first book is the coming of age years. It's me growing up in Philadelphia, and a lot of anecdotes and crazy things happened to me during the 60s and 70s. Book 2 is simply the police officer years. That's my 11 years as a police officer in Ben Salem Township, Pennsylvania. That's the northern suburb of Philly, and a lot of things that obviously happened there, from rookie patrol officer to detective sergeant and politics and everything that happened in between. And the third book was going to be my whole FBI career, but as I started writing it, I said, wow, a lot of stuff happened in the first 10 years. So I decided to end it with a longish chapter on the Unabomber case, and I timed that publication, coincidentally or not, with the release of the miniseries on the Discovery Channel back in August of 2017, Manhunt, Unabomber. And they've sort of been companion pieces ever since. Now, of course, the show is on Netflix all around the world. And I can tell when I'm getting emails from England, then next from Germany, then next from, Switzerland, then it moves to South Africa, then it moves to Australia. So Netflix kind of it doesn't just go on Netflix all around the world at once, I've learned. It happens like maybe once a month they'll release it to a new country, and I get a whole new set of fans there. So long-winded answer to your question, Eric. I sometimes do that, but I wanted to kind of give sort of an overall view of why I decided to write these books. My kids, other friends, hey, you told this story before. It's really kind of interesting. I never expect an ending like that. And they said, put it on paper. So for about 5 years, I sat down and wrote, I forget how many thousand words now total, but a lot of them. And the books are doing well. And especially with the third book came out, people are going back now and buying 1 and 2. And it's a fun thing to have people ask about, especially young people looking to get themselves started in a career somewhere, not sure what they want to do. And that was kind of the purpose behind book 1, and certainly book 2 and book 3 backed that up.
Okay, a couple quick questions on that. Number 1, is book 4 actually finished?
Book 4, I've started it, and it'll probably be out at this point in early 2020. So sorry, it's still a little bit of a wait for that. But the miniseries really threw me off my game a little bit in a good way. Like I said, I wrote 3 books in 5 years, virtually nonstop, from Italy to other countries to other parts of the U.S. And I just said I need about a year and a half off from actual writing. I still have a business. I have a company, James R. Fitzgerald Associates, LLC, and I still do work with clients in terms of usually it has to do with some sort of an anonymous letter that came into their company, or their client is getting some, reading some blog sites on some, web page somewhere, and they want to know who wrote this. So I do still employ my forensic linguistic skill set in the private sector. I am working with some police agencies and prosecutors' offices actually around the world on cases. And I just do enough of that. I'm giving some talks now around the country and around the world, heading to Denmark in December. So the writing took a little bit of a backseat. I figured I deserve a break after 5 years of pretty much straight writing. And but I am going to get back into it, and I have started it already. And I'm hoping by early 2020, book 4 will be out, which will complete my FBI career and actually my first 10 years in retirement, covering Hollywood and different things like that.
Right now, as a podcaster, I'm sure you know that I enjoy audio, and I'm a bit of an evangelist. How about an audiobook? Have you looked into that?
Yes, I have. I've talked to my publisher about that. The question is, do I read it? Does someone else read it? Do I kind of combine all 3 books? So there's some talk about that. And I've listened to audiobooks in the past, and I've thoroughly enjoyed them. So that is, Eric, something on the horizon. They're not out yet, but let's see if that can come out. You're not the first podcast person or media person to ask me that question. So I am contemplating it, and we'll see when, in fact, it comes to fruition.
Okay, you may want to write this down too, ACX, and you can look that up. It's Audiobook Connection Exchange, and it is an alternative if you, let's say, don't wish to go through the publisher, you wish to do it on your own, you can work out with a narrator through royalty splits or straight fee to get published. One of my previous guests, Andrew Werlin, is a fantastic narrator. He does a lot with ACX.
I've already written it down. Thank you for that, and I will look into it.
All right. Now, let's start out with the baseline of your career. Now, I understand that when you were a little kid, you were really influenced by Lindbergh. Do you want to go into that a little?
Yeah, I was. Growing up as a real little kid in the 50s, but certainly coming of age in the 60s and 70s, and having been born to parents a little bit late in life. My dad was 50 and my mom was 40 when I was born, and I have 3 older sisters, 16, 14, and 12 years older than me. And all of a sudden, little Jimmy comes along. Surprise, surprise. But it was good for them and certainly great for me. But I would hear them talk as I get older. And, that generation, the heroes those people had, who grew up through the early part of the 20th century were pretty much genuine heroes. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, perhaps FDR. I mean, depending on your politics, whatever. But certainly, away from war and politics and all that stuff was young Charles Lindbergh, the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And that was the biggest story of the time in, I think, 1928, 29. And no one had done it before he did it. So he's a good-looking guy. He marries, a beautiful, wealthy woman. They move only about 10 miles away from where I was living at the time, as the crow flies anyway, in Hopewell, New Jersey, with a mansion on a few acres of property. Next thing you know, headlines, their baby, I think less than a year old, was kidnapped. And it became the story of the century and the eventual trial of the century. And I won't go into all of it now, but sure. They were, the baby was kidnapped and ransom notes are left at the scene. Other ones come through the mail or to other people, and Charles is paying money. He's talking to the FBI wasn't even in charge of this case because FBI did not have jurisdiction over kidnappings back then. It was not a federal crime, believe it or not. In the late 20s, J. Edgar Hoover changed that within a few years, but the New Jersey State Police really ran with us, and they eventually identified someone named Bruno Hoffman, and he was arrested and eventually tried, convicted, and went to jail. So my parents talked, and he was executed, I should say, most importantly. Fascinating case. My parents always talked about it as when I was a kid. And finally, I went to I used to go to the library every week to get books out. The local Olney branch of the Philadelphia Library, I could walk there, take my bike sometimes. And I would usually get kiddie books, young books in that little section there. And I finally went downstairs once and looked for a book called Kidnap. And it's not the Robert Louis Stevenson book. It's a book about the Lindbergh kidnapping. And this was my first adult book I ever read. I was no more than 10 years old. And it may have taken me a little bit longer than some of my kiddie books, my parents were impressed that I was reading this book, and I would ask them some questions, and they would even ask me, well, if you look that up, you'll see exactly what happened. And it just fascinated me. I'm not sure that they've even used the word forensics in that book to describe how the crime scene was analyzed. The ladder left at the scene. They brought an expert in who broke down the exact type of wood, that the handmade ladder was comprised of. And eventually, when Bruno Hauptmann was identified, they went into his attic, and the same expert could scientifically compare the wood from the ladder to the wood there. There was linguistics involved because there were notes. They met somebody in a cemetery, and they heard a German accent, and they put that together. So it's a fascinating book to anybody listening to your show today, Eric. I mean, it's a 1962 book simply called Kidnap, and it's an early, it's a throwback investigation, if you will, of the biggest case of the century. Certainly, I think through most of it, people years later would say, "Oh, O.J. Simpson murder, is the biggest case of the century." But I think from a real sort of forensic perspective and real crime perspective, the Lindbergh kidnapping was probably the crime of the 20th century. And it influenced me as a young boy about a giant puzzle of real life people and sometimes real dead people, and how investigators, police, detectives, agents, whatever you want to call them, can come into a scene knowing almost nothing, but start piecing together these elaborate and amorphous puzzle pieces, and some that aren't even existent at the crime scene at the time, meaning subsequent letters that come in, subsequent sightings in a kidnap type case, and all of a sudden they built their case enough to where they had grounds for a search warrant, grounds for a arrest warrant, and of course a trial and conviction, et cetera, et cetera. And as a young boy, that's something that I just said, boy, I really think I'd love to do that someday. And the psychology behind this, and it got me interested in psychology. And before long, I'm in college. Here's this brand new major being offered, law enforcement and corrections, they called it then, which combined everything I was interested in as a kid. And that was my major. And I've been following through in that path ever since. But I don't want to make it sound callous. Thanks to the Lindbergh kidnapping, we all wish that never happened. But that was a case that just opened my eyes up, 40 years after it happened, or at least 30 years after it happened. I'm reading about it, and it just fascinated me. And boy, could I ever work a case something like that someday. And Unabomber was a little bit different, but actually some of the same methodologies and forensic type analysis was employed. And here I was, one of the major factors in fact, resolving that matter too.
That brings up a good question. Both obviously are hugely well known or notorious. The Lindbergh kidnapping and Unabomber, going to both ends. What do you think determines this case is going to be the crime of the century, and then some other case which may have even more moving parts, more scary elements, and things like that is virtually obscure?
Two things probably, no doubt, equally important. Who is the victim, or who are the victims, and media interest. Throw in longevity of crime, meaning does it happen just once? Does it happen over a year, over 17 years, like with Unabomber? And how tragic, if you will, how demonic does the perpetrator seem to be in carrying out these crimes, and what's the rationale behind them? So I started with sort of two factors. You can kind of maybe branch those off and do a few sub factors in there, but basically, who are your victims, and what's the media interest? And there are, and we would in the profiling unit back in the day, we would grimace at each other and say, how many little cute little African American girls are being killed in the inner city somewhere, just like maybe a certain cute little blonde girl, white girl was killed, in some other suburb somewhere or some rural area and why does the latter case get all the headlines, and the poor little girl, or maybe even multiple girls in inner city Detroit or Chicago, it doesn't get anything more than maybe a B1 page on the inside of the newspaper. So all those factors kick in, Eric, and I mean probably even some others, but there's a rubbernecking effect, and old men or old women being killed. Yeah, I'll get some news coverage, but make it an attractive, younger woman, probably white, or make it a baby of some sort who is, the heir to some notoriety, be it positive or negative. That's going to get the coverage, and that's what the media focuses on. And, it's lopsided to some degrees. But I will tell you this, when law enforcement gets involved, because I've worked the cases that are really big with all kinds of tentacles attached to media outlets and magazines and notoriety, and yes, even podcasts. But I will work those cases with the same diligence as I will the poor, Hispanic kid from the inner city who goes missing and then his body is found, a week later or something like that. Certainly, I will put as much effort in. What we may not have, though, is the overall machine, if you will, behind it, where a giant task force is set up of dozens and dozens of people, because the working bees really have very little say in that particular factor. But I know one us worker bees at whatever level, as a profiler, as a street investigator, as a uniformed cop, we'll still want to do our best, and that's been my experience, to bring this case to an end, to find out who the perpetrator is, why, stop him before he does it again. But there are other factors that kick in terms of why one case gets more coverage than the other, gets more personnel assigned to it, a higher budget, and it has to do with some of the demographic and basically media-involved reasons that I've already mentioned.
You mentioned rubbernecking effect. I think that's especially appropriate. Would you agree that it's natural that all of us kind of have a lurid fascination to what is perceived as evil, going back to stories about vampires even?
Oh, and probably beyond that with Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And sure, even from a biblical sense, we do. Part of it, I think, is a defense mechanism. We want to know, we first of all are very grateful, whatever the story is, whatever the tragic accident is, homicide, attempted murder, whatever, we're so glad it's not us or one of our loved ones. But there's a part of us that also wants to find out more and figure out, well, all right, it wasn't me or my loved ones this time. Is there a way I can make sure this doesn't happen to me again? Or it doesn't happen to me in any way, shape, or form again, like it happened with these other victims. So, yeah, I think there is a natural interest in that. And this is no secret, probably, and your listeners may be aware of this, but the highest demographic or audience for most of these TV shows about true crime, they're certainly fictionalized versions of them, women. And certainly the movies, is middle-aged women, and mostly white women. And and there's psychologists and sociologists that have studied this, and I go now. 2 years I'm going already. I'll be going again in New Orleans in June to an event called CrimeCon. And it's a true crime conference. And it had 1,000 people in Indianapolis in 2017. We had about 3,500 in Nashville back in May. And they already have 5,000 tickets sold for New Orleans in June of next year. And it's a true crime conference over 3 days. And I'm there with my various colleagues. We give talks, we put presentations on, and we always make sure that, hey, this is about the victims, this is how we're going to help you not become victims yourself. But the audience, Eric, is 85% middle-aged women. Many of them bring their daughters with them. I think you have to be 18 to get in. So that's the audience that, I work for Criminal Minds, technical advisor. My good friend worked there as one of the head writers, and they know their audience is mostly women, and that's why if you watch the show, about at least every other episode, approximately, it has an attractive younger woman as the victim, or a series of these younger women as victims, usually white, and they get the highest ratings. I wouldn't call it racism or sexism. It's just these shows are written to support the largest audience out there, and pick your psychological or behaviorally oriented reason why women of certain ages like these shows, and these shows will then write to them. That's what they do. So rubbernecking is part of it. It seemed like driving down the highway and there's the accident across the street, and your traffic's not impeded at all on your side, but everybody slows down because, boy, that could have been me. What did I do wrong, or what did he do wrong? And I make sure I don't do wrong down the line, and part of it just builds into it's survivalism too, and it goes back into our DNA from the earliest days of trying to get through living in the cruel world in which we do.
Do you ever worry that you've been to actual crime scenes? You deal with the actual visceral elements, the smell, the conditions, things like that. Whereas somebody such as myself or anyone else who's watching it on television or reading a book, I feel like it's almost sanitized for us. And we may not be drawing the full impact, and that could be causing it to be romanticized. Like Silence of the Lambs has been considered a romance movie.
Huh. Not a rom-com, I hope. Not a romantic comedy.
Well, he said some lines that were very dark humor, for sure.
Yeah, and I know where you're going with this, and TV and movies and entertainment, there is just a fine line there in how it's presented. And of course, over the years, it was more, and back in the early days of true crime, and I remember watching the movie In Cold Blood, based on Truman Capote's nonfiction book, of course. And it isn't until the very end, you're not even sure you're going to see the crime, but they eventually do. And then even back in, I think the movie's from the late 60s at some point, but the violence it's a black and white movie, and it's not all that pronounced on screen, but you certainly get the psychological, visceral feel of knowing what's happening to the Cutter family as the two criminals are going through the house and basically taking them out. Now that changed over the years. Sometimes it's it's these horror movies or these graphic representations on screen of some kind of a slasher, a movie that never did anything for me at all. I refuse to watch them. Show me a good psychological thriller, and yeah, maybe there are people dying in it, and maybe they're even being mutilated, but I don't need to see that part, because yeah, I have seen that in real life, not as it's happening, but in some cases only minutes, if not hours after it did. Gunshot wounds, knife wounds, and things done to bodies that are very unpleasant. And certainly years later, as a profiler, I looked at videotapes of crime scenes and still pictures and autopsies, and they're still difficult after all these years. We're all human beings with feelings. Most of us have families of some sort, either your own kids or nieces, nephews, neighbor kids, whatever, and you see someone violated. We'll just leave it at that for your audience, in the way that some people have been. It is very tough, and you have to really put that early on in my career. I try to describe this in my books. You have to really build a wall and like a light switch inside your brain that as soon as you get in that car and you're on your way home, you have to find a spot where you switch off what you experience for those 8, 10, 15 hours of the day before. And when you're walking your door with your kids, your family, your wife, your husband, cat, dog, whatever, the other Jim or the other Eric, walks in the door, and you leave that stuff behind. It's always in there, floating through the various recesses of your brain. Sometimes you do go to bed at night and think about not just the crime scene, but who is the person that would have perpetrated and created this particular crime scene. And then you try to work the case. And I've probably fallen asleep a few times thinking, maybe it's this kind of guy who has this kind of a background, and woke up and took some notes on the nightstand next to me, then went back to sleep. But I try to put it out of my brain when I get home. And now, 11 years into retirement, I'm not looking as much at crime scene pictures at all anymore, quite frankly. I'm certainly not going to crime scenes. Now it's more written communications as a forensic linguist I'm going to. But people can be very creative with their words too, and put some very scary and ominous sort of wording onto a blog posting or an email or even an old school letter they send to someone. And that can certainly make you think twice too, but it also tells me, as that profiler and linguist, more about the author here and whether he or she will ever carry out what's being suggested in this written communication. So, it's a lot of, I learned in my earliest days of law enforcement that one really does have to delineate the job from the home. And as a sergeant, I would stand in front of my men and women at roll call and kind of remind them that, after reading the stolen car list and who's wanted for what, and watch out, the burglar alarm is out at this facility tonight. But I'd say, hey, make sure when you go home, you turn on MTV or you read the comics in the newspaper or the sports page. Don't make this your entire life, because it'll screw you up. And even if you're not in law enforcement and your entire life is just watching true crime TV shows or even the fictionalized versions, sure, it's going to catch up with you after a while.
So you essentially compartmentalized. Now, did you ever seek any kind of therapy or anything to kind of help with that, or would you recommend that to agents and police?
I never did. I would talk things out with senior officers or agents. If you read my book too, there was a kind of the middle section of it. There was a bad political environment in my police department for 2 years in the mid '80s, and there were some legal actions being considered, and my lawyer strongly suggested I go and see a police psychologist. But it really wasn't about crime scenes. It really wasn't about the victimization of some people. That those things bothered me. Those things I took very seriously. But I'll use your word. I could compartmentalize those type things very well. There was more being screwed with and messed with on a daily basis in sort of a political level. And so besides all the gunplay and the car chases and arrest for rape and murder and everything in my second book, there is a section of it to how to deal like a bad political situation. So the only time I had to go see a shrink was that, and really my lawyer recommended it because we were considering legal action, and he was helpful, and he walked me through some things, and I would have no problem with a current day law enforcement officer at any level, store detective to the top FBI agent somewhere, who just felt that a certain crime scenes were catching up with him or her, and if they could have to talk to a professional, hopefully they can find the right one who has some experience with that, maybe PTSD, something like that, maybe counseled some military folks, and I think that could be very helpful, and I would certainly encourage that if the person ever felt that their everyday life was catching up to them in that regard.
Well, now I believe in book 2. I haven't gotten to the books yet, but I believe in book 2 you talked about one of your most proud, I guess, arrests, which I really enjoyed the story, and I'm hoping you can share now. And it's about a stop that you had made where one car was tailing another.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Looking back at my life, if people ask me what was your best arrest or whatever, and of course people know about Unabomber and DC Sniper and even Anthrax. I was indirectly involved in the eventual arrest of that. But yeah, as a young, I had about 4 years one time. I just came out of plainclothes. I was 2 years as a plainclothes officer, making a lot of arrests there with long hair and denim jacket and half a beard and making drug buys. I would sit up in a billboard overlooking a Amtrak train station. And
did you have the porn stash?
Did not have a porn stash.
Okay.
but gee, thanks for asking. I just let my beard grow a few days at a time just to look kind of grimy. But no, I never did stash very well. So anyway, but then I come back in uniform, and within about a month, I'm just sitting in an intersection. I'm going to grad school at the time. I really wanted to pull over. It was kind of a quiet night. I answered my calls. I wanted to actually study. I think I was doing statistics that that semester. I said, I need a half hour here. I'll sit at this intersection. Anyway, 2 cars go flying through a red light, and I said, whoa, that's weird. They got to be following each other. And all I can do is stop one car, and they both do. The van does a U-turn and just keeps going in the opposite direction. I pull this car over, and this guy is really funky. No tag on the back of the car. There's something in the windshield. The car is full of junk. He's being really antsy, and it's important. What I'm about to say is that just like with every car stop, which is the most dangerous thing a police officer does on a daily basis, I did everything right. I shined my spotlight into his outside mirror, which serves to kind of blind him. I stood behind him to a certain degree. He had to look up over his left-hand shoulder, and I'm a lefty, so my hand is always near my gun. I didn't actually have it on him, but he's by himself. I can tell he's a badass kind of dude, big arms, tats. The car is really messy, and there's a list on his windshield. I didn't really pick up on at first, of a bunch of addresses. I'm talking to him. He has no license, no registration. He can't explain what he's doing, making some kind of delivery somewhere. And so that's kind of weird. I just happened to glance at the list with my flashlight. I'm keeping an eye on him too, because I'm exposing myself a bit to him. And as I've written in the book, this may be the first time I ever used forensic linguistics to solve a case. And that's very loosely translated, as you'll hear here. Mm-hmm. Here's a list on a yellow legal pad, literally about 25 addresses, and I scan them one line at a time in about 5 seconds, and they all seem innocuous. They mean nothing to me, except one happens to be a street in Ben Salem, the town where I'm working. And I said, I recognize that address and street. Interesting, but I keep going. I said, all right, sit here. I'm going to go back and check some things out. So I go back to my patrol car. I run the guy's name that he gave me, date of birth. Nothing comes back. The car, I was going to go back, get the VIN off the car. And all of a sudden, and any law enforcement officers listening will know, all of a sudden you hear over the radio, beep, beep, beep. That means a major crime just went down. It's like, all cars get ready. We're about to give you some information. So I'm still keeping my eye on the guy ahead of me. And next thing you know, there's just been a house invasion in the Trevose section of Ben Salem. People tied up, beaten, robbery. 5 suspects got away in a van and a white car. And they had shotguns and weapons with them. And the address is 1234 Gumball Street, we'll say. And all of a sudden it hit me. On that list of 25 addresses, right in the middle, 1234 Gumball Street. It's actually a different street, but just for our purposes. Right. And I said, this is too much of a coincidence. This guy is too shaky. There was a van in front of him. They described the van, another car. I quickly called for backup, and lo and behold, brought him out and got him down on his knees. He had not makeup, but he had a hair color, hair dye in his head, trying to make himself look different. The bottom line was this guy with his buddies used that list to trick their way into a house of another person. And the guy's parents were there, and I think like a teenager or something. They tied them all up, beat them, and robbed them, and took money from them. And eventually we got the people out of the van in another town about 20 miles away. My guy never confessed until 2 years later. He called us up. We went to prison to interview him. And he said, I'm going to give everybody up. I can't take prison anymore. The DA, the assistant district attorney I'm with, walks out of the office. And I'll end the story here. I appreciate you asking it, Eric. But the inmate in his orange jumpsuit looks around a little bit. And he knows we're just by ourselves. He goes, so Officer Fitzgerald? I said, yeah. Actually, he knew I was Sergeant then, but I didn't bother correcting him. He said, I mean Sergeant Fitzgerald. I'm not sure if you knew this, but you knew how close you were to being killed that night by me? And this kind of takes me aback, but you can't show these guys fear. You can't show surprise. And I said, tell me, Tim. It wasn't his real name. Well, I had a sawed-off shotgun next to me in the car under some debris. I said, oh, yeah, we found it later. Well, as you were walking up to me, I was going to pull that on you, blast you, and take off because I knew what we had just done. Okay, keep going. And he said, but I got to tell you, you put that friggin' spotlight in my eyes. You stood behind me the whole time. I had to reach look over my shoulder. I knew your left hand, you're a lefty, so he's sizing me up this whole time. And I saw you're a lefty in your hand. Now you had the advantage. I knew I couldn't have gotten my gun out quick enough, so I let you live.
Wow.
I kind of look at him and sort of sardonically, well, thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. Now let's bring in the other two guys that were involved here. But I did actually walk away.
You'd have chills.
It was kind of one of those holy S moments where on the way home in the car with the ADA, I kind of told him, oh, that's interesting, Jim. But he wasn't a gun carrier, a sworn officer, and it never but it isn't too often in life that I think anybody gets a chance to kind of have a replay of something happened in your earlier life by another person who was there, and it happened to be something about it could have cost you your life. And this guy was a badass. He had a long criminal record. You know, he had assaulted some people in prison, but, you know, he was trying to get out and work a deal out and all that stuff. And the last part of the story was the two people we did try to arrest, we got one of them to confess. The other one used the twin defense. He had an identical twin brother who was not on the scene.
Oh, wow.
And the defense attorneys brought in the identical twin brother, and even they got to look different as they got older in life. They didn't dress alike, but they purposely dressed them, the defendant and the twin brother sitting in the audience dressed alike. They wore the same glasses, the same haircut, and the defense attorney said, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, look who's sitting in the audience today. That's, you know, Jim Smith, Tim's brother. Oh, actually, different names, but and the audience, the jury actually got confused, and they acquitted the twin who was on trial, which we know who that he did it. He partook in it, but having an identical twin, I guess every once in a while pays in life. I think he was killed a few years later in a shootout with someone, and so his life of crime didn't go any further. But so an amazing story there, and I do say because I didn't receive a radio call. There was no a source or informant information. This was happening. This was just a cop paying attention to his what's happening in front of him, and that caused the car stop to happen. But I also remembered the van, and I'm also proud of the survival skills that I was taught at the police academy and with senior officers. In the meantime, you got to always keep your guard up, even when it looks rather innocuous. And I think that definitely saved me that night. And that guy did a long term in prison, because of it. But more importantly, I'm still alive. So thanks for bringing that story up. I devote a whole chapter to that in there, and it really did open some doors for me in law enforcement and police work, and it's to this day stays the arrest I'm most proud of, because it was me from the very beginning to the very end that brought resolution to it.
Yeah, the twins can screw up a DNA case even.
Yes, it can. I'm familiar with that, but this is just strictly visual identification in this case, and that's all it took.
Now, I thought of something while you were describing the fact that you were studying when this went down, and you had mentioned that you kind of got into some political issues there. Is it possible the fact that you were in school trying to get a degree and things like that, maybe I've been in the military and things like that, and sometimes that can go against the grain of others who may be slightly more blue collar?
Excellent question. And I did have a college degree already, but I was working on my master's at Villanova at this point. And when this, just for the record, when this arrest went down, I wasn't literally studying, but I had my books with me looking for a nice place to pull over. Here I'm at this red light, the van, the car, all that stuff. But what I always try to create a paradigm when I tell this story, in that to younger people today, I do a lot of talks on college campuses and all, in that in many professions, including law enforcement, there was a time, boys and girls, as I'm talking to them, where, women had a lot of, restrictions against them. And basically when I was growing up, a woman, with few exceptions, secretary, nurse, teacher, maybe stewardess, as they called then, flight attendants, librarian. I mean, the jobs like that, and all good jobs. I guess if you had some blessed with some kind of looks or build, you could be a model or certainly an actor of some sort. But my point to all this, though, is right in the early 70s, as I'm getting my degree, at Penn State University in basically criminal justice. There are some women taking these courses too, and lo and behold, they're also applying for law enforcement jobs around the country. So what I found is, and also for the first time in law enforcement agencies, college graduates are mixing among them. Either guys are going to school already on the job, getting their degrees, or they're coming in hired with degrees. And so I always like to relate to women in law enforcement, and I was there with them side by side, and I was taking some of the barbs, some of the verbal punches at least, of being sort of an outsider, an outlier, if you will, in that, here are women coming into law enforcement. Oh, lady, don't let your smaller physique, whatever, get me killed. This is like an old senior cop talking. But they'd also, almost in the same breath, look over at me and say, hey, kid, don't let your college degree get me killed either. Mm-hmm. So I felt a kinship to some degree and a relationship with my sisters in law enforcement, because here I am, a college grad in law enforcement. We're both new. We're both sort of, trailblazers here in that regard. And no one's saying we were better or smarter, or we, became better cops in the long run. Everybody is still different in how they do their job, how they pay attention, and their work ethic, and all those type of things. But I was a strong proponent, and there are some, females now my age who are rookies with me that are appreciative of the fact that I stood there by them when they took some grief, and I would back them up on different calls, or maybe some other officers didn't or took their time getting there. And quite frankly, I realized the value of women officers. I mean, this sounds so trite to even say it now. Big deal. Woman, man, in terms of the job, if they're hardworking, they're smart, and they care about it, they're going to do well. But there are some domestic situations which, the husband's drunk and he's slapping the wife around, or the kids, whatever, we get called, and two male cops show up. This guy wants to fight both of us. Right. But we learned after a while, send a female in, keep her in sight, because she may be smaller and thinner, but there's no macho type thing going on. And she could almost always calm him down. We would deal, with the wife. Everybody's in sight of each other. And in most cases that worked in a great deal. So yeah, the college degree was almost like a curse on some of us coming into law enforcement in the mid '70s when I did. But right alongside of us were female officers, and we both kind of went through our little hazing period together. But I think everybody eventually proved themselves, and we all worked out fine. And now most departments around the country, you need at least a 2-year degree, and many of them require a full 4-year degree, which is fine. And of course, there's no limitations at all for for sex, male, female, whatever. As long as you can do the push-ups and run a mile in a certain time, as far as I'm concerned, you should be eligible to get into law enforcement.
Right. That leads into a story that kind of tangentially I related to, I guess you'd say. My wife is actually the library director at Langley Air Force Base and a librarian.
Oh, okay.
And way back when I was dating her in the 90s, and we were early married in the early aughties, she had been in Who's Who every year. And it was...
I think I know where this is going, but go ahead.
There was a funny story with it, and then it'll get to dark stories with you. But one time, I don't know, it was around 2005 or 6, I had written my first book, and I was feeling really good about myself, and I got a letter saying, from Who's Who, addressed to me. And I was like, wow, maybe I could be in Who's Who. Well, it turned out that they were offering me the ability to buy extra books since I knew somebody in Who's Who.
No.
So that was kind of a funny anecdote. But there's also the less funny anecdote, because the internet wasn't really around in the 80s and 90s, and Who's Who was used as a tool. Can you go into that?
Yes, it was. And as a kid, maybe I forget exactly when Who's Who first came out, but as a joke, I remember walking into and I got friendly with a librarian at my local library in Philadelphia, hey, what's the biggest book you have in here? It was always Who's Who. But of course, you couldn't check it out. It was a reference book kept in that little reference section. And there may have been one or two books bigger, but one of the thicker books around, and sometimes it was in two parts. And basically, Eric, as you know, what Who's Who is, it's ostensibly people, and I think they're broken down by country, but certainly people in the U.S. who made a name for themselves in some usually positive way. And it could be, politicians, it could be, business people. It may not be people you always read about in the newspaper or in the media, but they would be in there. Leaders of their industry or scientists, things like that. Well, it didn't take too long in the Unabomber investigation, and your listeners knew we were going to head there eventually. And before I was on board, remember the first bombings were 1978. I didn't come on board until 95. And actually all the bombings had been completed by the time I got on board the Unabomber task force. But in the mid 80s, before the first series of bombings stopped, remember the Unabomber went from 78 to 87, and there were 12 bombings then. And he stopped when the iconic composite sketch was released. He must have thought it looked like him, with the aviator sunglasses and the hoodie, and for whatever reason, he stopped bombing. But when a lot of extra research was being paid attention, when some time was there to do it, the investigators knew that victimology had to be determined somehow. Why was this Unabomber person choosing the victims that he chose? And while not all of them were 100% clear, some bombs, some improvised explosive devices, IEDs, were just left at the scene. Others of them were sent through the mail to people. And this certainly included, it's the only way that the Unabomber killed people when he came back in 1993 with his devices, and they were only sent through the mail because he almost got caught when the person saw him and created that composite sketch. Bottom line is, long story here, what they determined is the Unabomber was getting his victim information, his target information, if you will, from the book Who's Who. And we know that because with two of the victims, there was actually a mistake in Who's Who. I mean, the name was right, so-and-so, comma, Junior, 1510 Fifth Avenue, where the person actually lived 1510 Fifth Street. But the Unabomber picked up the avenue from Who's Who, which is really the only place it was mistakenly listed. And then some other target, some other victim, had a similar sort of mistake in the address to his package. Very minor, insignificant mistake, but it was also in Who's Who. So that's when investigators became convinced, and it was really one of the only clues we had at the time, before the manifesto was received, was that this guy frequented one or more libraries somewhere, and he was using these Who's Who book somewhere to pick out his target information. So as you can imagine, that became a lead to every FBI division in the U.S. and an agent in every division and every resident agency. And there's 56 divisions and hundreds of smaller satellite offices. An agent was assigned to go to every library in his or her region and interview the head librarian and others and ask, have you seen anybody coming around here and looking at this book, maybe a bit disheveled? And we try to give the profile of what the person looked like. I'm not sure they said disheveled, but just someone seems very, mission-oriented, very focused, maybe doesn't talk a whole lot, and maybe just uses this book, nothing else. And, some information came out of that, maybe check this guy out, check that guy. But the bottom line is nothing of any positive value came out from those leads. It turns out we were right. And even when we went inside Kaczynski's cabin and found all his documentation about everything he did, sure enough, there are some handwritten references to Who's Who book volume, 72, whatever it was, and there's some potential target information listed there. So yeah, the kudos to the agents whoever figured out that somehow that is where Kaczynski was getting his target information. You'd also do other research if it's some kind of a computer scientist or some kind of a marketing executive, like with Thomas Moser, his penultimate bombing victim in northern New Jersey in November of 1994. And he worked for a marketing firm that was representing Exxon after the Exxon Valdez oil spill in the 1980s, and so the Unabomber was mad at that guy, and he sent him a bomb. But his address, his actual home address, came out of the Who's Who book. So, yes, the Unabomber knew how to use a library, and he certainly knew the value of Who's Who. It would be, of course, anti-technology for him to go on the internet to look up these addresses. Of course, the internet wasn't around for most of his bombing career, but it wasn't too high tech to borrow from, the 500-year-old printing press. I guess that was pre-industrial revolution, so that was okay. And look at a book in a library and come up with the exact address of where he was going to send one of his lethal bombs. So again, knowing that this guy was going to a library was one clue that we were pretty sure was accurate, and it was in fact accurate. But as we know, there's thousands and thousands of little libraries, university libraries, municipal libraries, everything in between, and unfortunately, no one. If anybody went to the Lincoln, Montana library after all these years, I'm not sure if they actually went there, but nonetheless, nothing positive came out of that lead.
Okay, I was going to ask that. Also, a few rapid fire questions, because you talk about Kaczynski quite a lot in a ton of podcasts, and I recommend people check them out. And obviously your long chapter in the book, and you have a miniseries. So there's a wealth of material out there. Before he was caught, though, I'm curious. You had 2,500 suspects. Was he one of those 2,500 suspects?
No. And I usuly round that number off. So there were 2,499 before him, and he became the 2,500th suspect. No. We had databases from places that his name would have been in, but because the earlier profiles had him as a younger person, they didn't go back into the 70s or even the 1960s when he would have been at University of Michigan, where he would have had a driver's license, in Illinois, in Utah, or even at Berkeley in California, because bombs were sent to University of Michigan, and that's where, or at least one device was sent there in 1985. That's where Kaczynski got his doctorate degree, master's and doctorate in math. Kaczynski taught at Berkeley in the late 60s, and at least one device went there, maybe even two, if memory serves correct. And so we figured maybe somehow this person has some kind of a connection. So if we kept going backwards like another 10 years on these databases, we eventually would have found what we were looking for, of course, is a nexus to one person or even 100 persons who's living in Illinois at the time of these bombings, who perhaps went to one of the universities in Illinois, which Kaczynski never did, who was living in Utah for a while, which Kaczynski did a bit, who may have had a driver's license there, who may have had a driver's license in California, who may have gone to Berkeley, and they put all these databases together and start spitting out, names, and most likely would have been, 100, 200 names. And we had these names. All of them were checked, but none of them were our person. So we were in the process, after the manifesto went out, of taking the databases and going back to these locations and getting updated versions of them going back 10 more years. And I think we could possibly then have come up with the name Theodore J. Kaczynski, and a guy living in a cabin in Montana. It's probably not him, but let's go check him out. And sure enough, it would have been him. So he was not on that list of 2,500 suspects. Some who were named, some who weren't named, some who were called in by ex-wives and lawyers. It's my husband, and it's my client who hasn't paid me for a year. And so we knew some of those were sort of frivolous. Others came in. I saw a guy on the BART the San Francisco subway system. He looked just like the composite, but, no name. All we had was a date and a location. So a lot of the suspects were there. We did have some names on others, some with military backgrounds, some with, explosive trainings type background. But all of those, fell off the table until all of a sudden Theodore Kaczynski, and he didn't even go to the top right away, because, like I said, a college professor living in a cabin and no car, no means to get around. But once we got the linguistics involved, and it was my team that was in charge of, building the case against him from a language perspective, well, it was pretty clear to us that we've got our man, and that's how that all came down.
Very cool. And I do want to put a pin into the hoax letters or, people calling in false confessions and things like that, and maybe talk about it in a minute. Couple other observations about Kaczynski before I move on. One, I find it kind of ironic, and I don't know if you do as well, that you have mentioned several times that he was nearly perfect in his writing, grammar, spelling, everything he did. Isn't it kind of the ultimate irony that his usage of the "you can't eat your cake and have it too" was in fact correct, but because it was antiquated, that's what got him, was being too perfect?
Yeah, I mean, irony with a capital I and uppercase letters and underlined and boldened. Yeah, it is. And he was very proud of his language. Math and language are not all that different. If you take a generative syntax course, which I did in attaining my second master's degree, this one at Georgetown. And so as a mathematician and be able to, do numbers, do wonders with numbers and mathematical formula, whatever, he was just as proud in how he would construct, a sentence formula, so to speak. And you're right, he virtually never made a mistake. He even included a corrections page. So the front cover of the manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future by FC, the next 3 pages are corrections that he wanted the reader to know before they, actually got into the body of the manifesto itself. And we did some research, of course, and as I'm sure most of your listeners know, that of course the manifesto was not typed on a word processor. It was a 1930s era manual typewriter, so you just couldn't cut and paste and delete and change your words around if you notice a mistake. So, but in the early days of writing theses and dissertations, you were allowed to actually formally present them at your defense or turning it into your university with a corrections page, because no one could rewrite an entire thesis if they left out one word or even something like that. And again, to use the word ironic, the Unabomber's mistakes were so minor. Is the period inside the quotation mark or outside the quotation mark at the end of a sentence? Did he spell, there, THEIR, when it should have been THERE? Everybody knew what it meant. It's a common typo, and these had 3 pages of these. So yeah, that showed us the importance of language to him, the importance of being perfect. And of course, you couple this with his devices. They didn't always kill. They always detonated to some degree. They didn't always kill as he would have preferred. He had to go through, I think, 8, maybe even 10 bombings before he successfully killed someone in 1985 in his first actual successful bombing in that regard. So, but he was very proud of his writing style, and it had to bother him to no end that his august, utilization of this, 16th century proverb or axiom, probably originally written as "ye can't eat ye cake and have it too," of course was changed around at the beginning of the 20th century for some reason, where it's "you can't have your cake and eat it too," which when you think about it doesn't make as much sense as the other way around. And and that was the key. That was really the key that opened his cabin door in terms of a search warrant, because I had people, hey, Fitz, have fun, run with your little word, collection thing there, and we'll get back to you. And everyone's looking for the fingerprints and looking for, any kind of other type of evidence, eyewitness evidence that could put Kaczynski somewhere near a crime scene. But it really came down to what got that cabin door open legally with a search warrant was reference to a cake and eating it and having it at the same time, and about 599 other side-by-side comparisons too of almost identical sentences, certainly thematically, topically, and grammatically, written by Ted Kaczynski, but also written by the Unabomber. And that's eventually what a judge looked at and said, well, if these are written this close, these closely assembled sentences, there's at least enough for a search warrant here. Go for it. And the rest, as they say, is book, television, and criminal justice history.
Last item on Ted Kaczynski, and it's kind of an observation, but I find another irony. It seems in some ways that he may be happy as a clam where he is right now. It matches his cabin. He's fed, he's clothed, and he probably can get all the books he wants.
You're not far off, Eric. I've read some of the things he's written. I tried to interview him once in 2007, and it fell through. And I sent him a letter back in 2016, and he never answered it. But I know he's writing to other people, and some of those letters have been published. And I know he fell in love with someone. He finally met a woman, and he was very frustrated in his life as a heterosexual man. He was a virgin well into his, certainly into his mid-50s, and by no choice of his own. And all of a sudden, he goes off to prison, and he's this hero of this anarchist set, and the leftists, as he would describe in his manifesto. Now they're writing him left and right. Some are coming to visit him. Like I said, he was engaged. He finally met a woman. He was engaged to be married, and very sadly, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she died. And I felt bad for her, and maybe the one woman he ever loved, died when they never could even touch each other. They would just talk through a phone and with a thick inch thick piece of glass between them, and they could never even touch. There would be no conjugal visits in the federal system, so that's the best they could do. And,
question about her: was she a hybristophiliac?
Meaning about being touched or germs or something?
No.
Remind me.
It's hard to say. Hybristophilia. I talked to another psychologist about it. It's about women who are particularly attracted to serial killers and spree killers.
Okay. I've probably heard that term before. There are not too many of those women out there, but I guess there's now enough to give them their own separate category, anophilia. Was she one of those? I believe he was the only one that she had any interest in. I don't think she was a serial killer groupie.
Okay.
I'm sure they're out there, bounce prison to prison. So I don't know if she's ever been diagnosed with anything like that. I know somebody wrote about her. Some journalist picked up on that story, and I don't think her family was too thrilled that she was spending all this time focused on Ted Kaczynski, a serial killer. And so that was her story, and she stuck to it with her family. But again, then she got sick and died. But other people have been writing him, and supposedly he gets these very graphic letters from some women describing all sorts of bizarre sex acts, and he actually turns some over to the correctional staff and say, you may want to recommend this woman, she's a psychologist, and he doesn't even like or believe in psychology or psychiatry. So yeah, I'm not sure how many other women like that have come to him. I'm certainly aware of those women. I'm not sure it's been a while since I've heard that term that you mentioned, so you caught me off guard there, but that's fine. And but there are a number of women strangely like that, and I know Seinfeld had an episode about that, and where George was visiting a woman in prison, and everything was so cool. Then finally she escapes. And now the whole relationship's ruined because no, I want you behind bars. It's a whole different way of control. Then blah blah blah. So There's a whole bizarre mindset, and these Menendez brothers supposedly have women writing to them left and right about getting engaged or married or whatever, and it's just a kind of a sad commentary. I'll let other people discuss what would attract women to them. I don't think you see too many men doing this with women violent offenders, and there are women violent offenders incarcerated for life or close to it, but this seems to be something strictly on the female end. I guess maybe they've been cheated on in the past and they realize my guy's not going to cheat on me, at least not with another woman in prison, so maybe that's all I need out of a man in my life.
And he's controlled, and there's Beauty and the Beast. I also...
Very much.
My pet theory, and I shared with a psychologist he hadn't heard before, is that they may be not dissimilar to these really beautiful teachers who take advantage of students. I kind of feel like it's control.
That's a very valid observation, and I wouldn't discount that.
Have you visited any other cases? And one that comes to mind is BTK. I wondered if you had explored any of his writings while you were in the FBI.
I did. I didn't do much with the original killings, which I think were most, I know they're Wichita, Kansas area, and they were in the 1980s. And when I came into the FBI, I went right to New York City after the academy and worked plenty of cases there, and then became a profiler in 1995. First case was Unabomber. So I came back from that, and I think it was the early 2000s after the BTK had taken a few years off, upwards of 10 years, I think. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden now he's writing letters and doing this, that, and the other. And one of the profilers in my unit, of course, knew I was studying forensic linguistics at Georgetown, and I had used language to successfully help solve the Unabomber case. And he said, hey, can you look at this letter written by BTK back in the early days? So this wasn't even one of his newer letters or whatever was found in the computer disk somehow. This was something that was handwritten. And he said, does this look like a native English speaker or someone who's maybe mentally challenged or has some kind of autism or dyslexia, anything like that? So I studied this letter for a better part of a half day, and it was only about 2 or 3 pages long, if I recall. And I wound up saying, no, this guy is using disguise. He writes English perfectly fine, but there is something in here that, he just wanted to disguise who he is for his identification purposes, and he makes up this kind of gibberish language. And because they weren't sure, should they look for a person who's mentally challenged, in and out of mental institutions, or have been so diagnosed by the courts, or someone, again, autistic or Asperger, something like that, or perhaps someone who didn't speak English as a second language. And I put all that aside and saying, look, I don't know who your killer is at this point, because I really wasn't getting into the depth of the case itself, because other agents were doing it, of course, and the Wichita PD. But I said, this letter right here that you show me, this is consistent with the other letters he sent, which were written in regular English, and this person is employing disguise here, because there's no pattern, there's no consistency to the different types of language features that were used. They're like being made up as this person went along. So I was actually going to write a report for them and sort of link all these letters together. And literally, I was like a day away from sitting down and spending 8 hours or so putting this report together. And the fellow profiler walks in the room, says, "Forget the report. They just made an arrest yesterday. They got BTK."
Oh wow!
Said, wow, great job. So, if we were going to go to trial, perhaps I would have testified something about these letters, but he wound up confessing, and there never was a trial. And that was my little role. I didn't do anything to solve the case. I was there kind of as a backup, but that he was employing disguise. Unlike the Unabomber never used disguise in any of his writings. He didn't have to, because he knew he was so far removed from any of his victims, and they were nationwide, where BTK, of course, was striking mostly right within the confines of Wichita, Kansas, and he wanted to kind of remove himself. He decided to kind of write one letter in sort of a tricky form, perhaps making it look like, I say tricky, but in a way that which disguise was used to make it look like perhaps yet another killer was involved in one particular crime, but that wasn't the case. They were all BTK, and he wrote all the letters involved in that case.
Perfect segue into what I wanted to talk to you about. Forensic countermeasures, and you just brought up one reason for it. I guess majority of the time is proximity, that the closer they are, maybe the more countermeasures they will use. And would you say that this has been going on for a long time, going all the way back to Jack the Ripper, let's say?
Yeah, and I mean, forensic countermeasures, also referred to as crime scene staging, and there are various ways an offender can enact sort of these measures to, in fact, cover up who was really involved. And usually the closer a criminal is to the crime, meaning not just geographical proximity, but perhaps with some connection to the victim or victims, that is when you'll tend to see some level of staging or forensic countermeasures. Kaczynski didn't really, the Unabomber, as we only knew him then, didn't really tend to do them too much because of he was so far removed from anyone's suspect list. He did, from a forensic perspective, and one of the envelopes he mailed to someone, maybe Dr. Galertner at Yale, there was a blonde hair under the stamp, and it was so clear that this hair under the stamp, it was just so it was so out of the ordinary for our Unabomber person, because he was so careful about evidence and not leaving it, of course, on the documents he wrote and sent to the New York Times and others, and certainly on the IEDs he shipped out. So this blonde hair was seen as something like a forensic countermeasure, and we didn't put a whole lot of thought into it. It was certainly maintained, but it turns out we found in one of his notes or journal entries after his arrest that on his way to San Francisco by bus, he was in a public men's room. There was a blonde hair on the floor. He picked it up, saved it, and when he finally put the letter together to mail off the device, whether it was a device or actually a letter, he carefully inserted that there. But Kaczynski, and I'll call him Unabomber, we didn't know who he was yet, in a few of his letters, including to Dr. Galertner, there was some disguise, and you could arguably call them forensic countermeasures. I also call them contraindicators, and that is a few lines of within language that he used to throw off the investigators. And in the letter to Dr. Galertner, there's two different sentences about a paragraph apart, in which he states that one of the very first sentences of that letter is, apparently people without college degrees don't count. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in that negated form of that sentence, it's clear that, ostensibly it's clear that the author doesn't have a college degree. And the next paragraph down, about 6 sentences later, it's and even people without just because you have a advanced degree doesn't make you smarter than me. I'm paraphrasing here. Mm-hmm. So, all right, the person doesn't have an advanced degree, doesn't have a college degree. This coming from a guy who makes no mistakes with his devices. There's no evidence at all on them of any sort to link to any one person.
Don't have to protest too much. Exactly,
and you put this in a letter, and you're sort of, and we know it's not much, but you're sort of telling the reader that you have no more than a high school degree. So that's not a whole lot, but it does narrow down the suspect pool. And I just couldn't. I said, no, something's not right here. This guy he's adding this in as a contraindicator. He is clearly has an advanced degree of some sort. And then when I dug out some of his other letters that nobody really paid too much attention to, and in a letter he wrote to the New York Times about publishing his manifesto, et cetera, and of course he always used the plural pronoun we, which we knew was bogus. We knew it was one person. And in one of those letters he wrote, we're getting tired of going into the Sierra Nevadas and with our practice bombs, after work and on weekends.
It wasn't the royal
so this
we?
guy's trying to. I'm sorry?
It wasn't the royal we? I'm out of curiosity.
No, it wasn't the royal we. We felt he certainly meant there's his group FC,
Okay.
which stood for Freedom Club, as he eventually wrote people. So all of a sudden, he's now telling us he lives in sort of central California near the Sierra Nevada mountain range. And by describing when he would go into these mountains to practice with his bombings, he has like a full-time job Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, because he's going in at night times and weekends. I said, no. First of all, this guy doesn't live in California, and he doesn't have a daily, everyday job. So now let's paint this into our updated profile, and we did that. So that's just one example with the Unabomber of ways he would try to trick people. I found with a lot of other cases, and especially of like husbands who murder their wives, wives who murder their husbands, they know they're going to be likely suspects. They'll come up with letters sometimes, and I've actually come up with a name for them. I actually coined this term, and I put it in a few, an article in my book. It's POMIC, and it's a lot of syllables coming up, Eric, so pay attention.
Okay.
POMIC stands for Post-Offense Manipulation of Investigation Communication. So essentially, it's someone sending a letter after a crime's been committed because they know they're a likely suspect, and they're going to say that, Joe Smith didn't do it, the likely suspect. Someone else did from the next county over. In fact, it may even be this guy, and they put some, well-known criminal name in there, and they try to dumb down the letter. They try to include things in there that they wouldn't normally write. But if you're a forensic linguist with some experience in this area, you can definitely determine some of these features, some of these factors, and you can figure out what's real and what's not real and what's trying to be covered up here. And the more work someone puts into disguising their writing style, and I don't just mean handwriting. Anybody can kind of do that, but you realize that the person is probably that much closer to the crime itself, and that says narrow in on someone very much nearby. So it's sort of something with use of the term POMIC that I put together, and I've been teaching in my forensic linguistic courses ever since. And a lot of linguists, a lot of academics, brilliant people that have studied language their whole lives, and they're finally asked 10 or 20 or even later 30 years into their linguistic career of studying vowel charts and the use of certain pronunciations of words in New England as opposed to the Deep South. And they're used to studying actual people's speaking style, their vernacular. But then all of a sudden, I have to teach them, no, criminals and bad people who are trying to cover up a crime or create a crime to this, they will employ an unnatural method, usually of writing in this case, that's not natural to who they are. And that's where some linguists get tripped up and say no, because criminals don't want to be caught, and they'll spend, especially an anonymous author who wants to get away with some kind of a crime, a cover-up, or whatever it may be, using this letter or this blog post, whatever. They'll spend as much time with the crime itself as they will also trying to keep anonymous in the communications they're putting together. So it's amazing the amount of work people will put into these type of letters, and sometimes they look very basic and very much put together quickly, but I realize that these people may put a lot of thought and time into it, including how to keep themselves anonymous, and they will pretend to perhaps have a lesser writing skill ability than they would normally possess. But as I've always said, it's much easier to dumb down in your writing style than it is to smart up. So it's very difficult for people who don't have good writing or communication skills, unless they're plagiarizing something word for word, to in fact, make themselves seem, smarter than they normally are. But a lot of people, doctors I've worked, nurses, lawyers that wrote out these letters, and they're generally good writers in real life, but they try to make these mistakes that just make no sense. And that's how we can ferret them out and get some of their known writings, and believe it or not, the punctuation features and some archaic spellings or something, even spacing between words, if it's handwritten, can help put them in jail for life. And there's a few in jail for life thanks to the linguistic work that I did in those cases.
So they're almost too clever by half.
You could say that, yeah. And if they didn't write the letter at all, same with Kaczynski, the Unabomber. I mean, people have asked me all the time, if he never wrote any letters at all, do you think we would have caught him? And I said, I'll tell you, this would have been a lot tougher without his letters to the New York Times, the manifesto. And we knew, and that's why we wanted to get it published, we knew somebody would recognize this somewhere. We all thought a teacher, a professor, someone like that, or some, writing partner or something, and maybe a family member. We didn't rule that out. And here it was, David, his brother, that came upon it, and took him a few months to make the call, but luckily nobody else died in the meantime. And but people who tend to write in association with their crimes tend to be a little bit smarter than the average bear, and they think they can get away with it, and they think they know enough about language to disguise enough about who they really are. But a good linguist can break all that down and tell a lot about the person based on the language utilized, either spoken or written. And of course, the more the better, and hopefully solve the crime before too long.
Thank God for narcissism, right?
That's a big part of it. You're right.
Speaking of that, Evil Genius. There was a docuseries on that. I think they called it the Pizza Bomber case at one point. But would that be considered a prime example of what you just described?
Yeah, I worked that case in real time in the early 2000s. And out of Erie, Pennsylvania, our FBI office up there, those and a few state police people came to Quantico a few times over that. I did spend some time working through that letter. That letter is on my list as one of the oddest letters I've ever seen or read in my life, certainly in terms of a criminal case. And I did offer, some information, some advice on it. But yeah, there's definitely people with high level of intelligence, a high level of narcissism, always a dangerous combination there. Throwing egotism and self-loathing and hatred of a lot of people around you and authority figures, and that's really all that thing was. Meaning the Evil Genius matter with the pizza delivery person. It was almost like a big fancy game they wanted to play. Challenge everybody around them. The bonus would have been getting the money, but if not, hey, let's have some fun doing it. And that's to me, that's the top. That's the priority reason they actually undertook what they did was, if we can get some money out of this, that's really cool. But let's run the cops all over town. And this pizza guy, he's meaningless to us anyway. So why even worry about him? And but bizarre case and. Yeah, I would have hated to be one of those uniform cops. I was a uniform cop, and if I was the guy that came up with him with the device wrapped around his neck, I'd have to believe him, and I wouldn't want to be too close to him, and I wouldn't be sure exactly how to get the device off him because apparently it was booby-trapped in a half dozen different ways. So, both evil and genius were involved there, and, pride goeth before the storm, and eventually it took a few years, but I think those people are all where they should be right now, and quite frankly, I think mostly dead, right?
Yeah. Now, moving forward, I said put a pin in it, but I think this leads well into, you probably had to deal with a lot of hoax letters, false confessions, things of that sort. As a forensic linguist, how do you deal with that?
Can you be a little more specific in what you mean about that?
Well, I imagine some of the crimes that you investigate, especially if they get popular, other people may write in and take credit. Okay.
Sure. And there's less false confessions in those regards because they won't sign their name. They just want to throw off the case and have some fun doing it. I remember the Wall Street Journal reporter who was kidnapped in Pakistan in early 2002,
Pearl?
right after Daniel Pearl, right after 9/11, and of course we had the Anthrax scare. I think it was January of '02, which is a few months later. He was kidnapped, and various media outlets received the pictures of him with the gun held to his head and holding up the newspaper. And lo and behold, I was asked to analyze that original newspaper, or the original email. But then, of course, a dozen other emails came in, at least, because the media put these things out, public right away. So all of a sudden now they're tasking me with, Jim, we know this one is real. Can you try to give us a linguistic profile of who wrote it? They're the ones with the attachments of Daniel Pearl. So I was doing an analysis of those things. But then also the other dozen, there may have been 15 to 20 emails that were coming into the same news agencies. Yeah, we have him now. We're going to take him, here. We're going to take him there. He's already dead. And then, so I was tasked with breaking down each one of those, and I could readily disavow each of those other ones that came in as being bogus and having nothing to do with the real matter at hand. And I did provide a profile of the writer of the original email, and it matched up pretty close to, in fact, the actual author, who was a native speaker of Urdu, in Pakistan, but he learned his English in the British system, possibly even in the UK, because it was sufficient enough, it was high functioning enough. But there were a few issues in there that I said he's probably not a native Brit, and of course he wasn't. He was from Pakistan, went to college in the UK, and then came back, became a terrorist, kidnapped Pearl, and we know how that all worked out. So, yeah, what we always try to do, though, is Kaczynski was smart as the Unabomber, and he included a 9-digit number in all the letters he wrote to the New York Times. So, in fact, he knew enough about these fake people who, in fact, would, could possibly try to assume his identity and pretend they're the Unabomber. So he included that Social Security looking number to keep his remote from others. And we also had the Midwest bomber in the spring of 2002. He was blowing up mailboxes around the Midwest, and people thought an ATF was involved, and the Postal Service, FBI got brought in. There was like a half a dozen. A couple people had their fingers damaged when they opened the mailbox. But this is right after 9/11, and Al Qaeda's, are they now, in the breadbasket of America, the U.S.? And I remember saying, something's not right here. Who goes after mailboxes? I mean, that's kids. But at some point, a letter came in to a newspaper, and it was a rambling thing. And I said, hey, I'm a firm believer. Let's publish any letter we can. Make sure any evidentiary or names, whatever, are taken out of any relevance. But this guy had a little phrase on the bottom. So what you want to do as an investigator is you always want to leave one part of the letter out. And this guy had some cute little quote on the bottom part of the letter, which really in and of itself wouldn't have helped solve the case. But I said, hey, let's publish this without that, so we'll know if any copycats come in, that won't be the case. So sure enough, we did publish it. It was actually my recommendation. And within days, a guy from the University of Wisconsin, he's on the student newspaper, he finally said, hey, I received a letter like this 2 weeks ago, and it's signed by one of our students. Here, it was him, and it was the identical letter, just signed by somebody, a real name. They tracked him down, and he was the Midwest bomber who was eventually arrested in Daddy's car using Daddy's credit card on spring break. So one example there. I just had another one flash through my head as I was talking about that. But yeah, I'm a big fan. Well, the DC sniper case, they wrote letters. The Lindbergh kidnapping letters. He put some kind of a little symbol, a dark circle, in with a line going through it of some sort. So these people are smart enough. Even the true criminals are smart enough to know that there are bogus criminals or wannabe naysayers to somehow come along and just mess up an investigation. So you'll know it's real when you see this symbol, when you see this this Social Security number, when you see that, which of course wasn't a real Social Security number of anybody with the Unabomber, or you see these other features mixed in somehow. And that's what you always make sure. Even if they don't request that, you always leave something out of a singular nature out of any kind of a letter you're going to put onto into the public, because you want to make sure you can separate the real ones that may come in from the fake ones. And that's one way. Of course, some criminals themselves know about that, but certainly in law enforcement, we know that too, and we would do our best to keep that certain part secret that only they know about.
Hard not to be sarcastic and say, well, it's good that they have pride in their work.
Well, it is, and that's, the ones that don't sometimes, they're the ones that are caught after one offense. I mean, there's a lot of potential serial killers out there, but because they're stupid, make mistakes, don't have pride in their work, they get caught. Same with serial bank robbers, serial rapists. It's the ones who sometimes are lucky, but they also have a decent IQ and a decent, thought process that they can, from beginning to end, sort of map out what they're going to do. Nothing's left to chance, or little's left to chance. They're the ones that become serial at whatever it is, whatever crime it is they're committing, and they have the pride too. But depending how manifest it becomes, they may get away with their crimes for a while.
Now, Jim, if you hadn't guessed, I could go on for about 3 more hours, but I'm sure you can't. So can people find out about your books and more about what you've done and bonus content on jamesrfitzgerald.com?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned my website. Yeah, www.jamesrfitzgerald.com. A lot of information there, where I'm going, speaking engagements. I'll be in Denmark in December.
I actually have a fan base there.
Well, if you can tweet that out, then let them know. I'll be in the University of Southern Denmark in Odense, the home of Hans Christian Andersen.
Cool.
On that Wednesday, I think it's December 12th, and looking forward to that. So you can check out that environment there. Be in New Zealand in April, but I'll hold that off for now. But yeah, go on my website. You can check out how to get my books. They're all on Amazon, of course, some bookstores, but Amazon has a good way to do it. I can send books out to people signed. We can work that out if they email me. That information's on my website. And it's all good stuff. And yeah, there are some bonus chapters from each of my books on my website under book 1, book 2, book 3. So yeah, check them out if you want to know a little bit more about me, and probably a lot more about me with the 3 books that I wrote. And I try to keep them a little bit personal about what it's like being, in law enforcement. And book 2 was written during the time of Florence, Missouri, and everything that was going on there. And cops were being really, raked over the coals, and they're all evil and racist. And I just wanted to kind of put a human face on law enforcement. No, we're not. And same with when I went into the FBI. No, we're not. We're humans. We have families. We want to go to work in the morning and come home at night. And so I try to put a little bit of a personal touch in my books, but it's also cops and robbers, like I said, and gunplay and car chases and all that stuff, and some really bad people. Few of them even wearing badges that I wound up arresting over the years. And a collar. I actually was one of the first people to ever arrest a Roman Catholic priest. I caught him in the act of abusing 2 young boys. In
Philadelphia, imagine that.
In Philadelphia, my own little town, and right in the suburbs of my hometown. And that opened the door to some things, but they were still only receiving slaps on the wrist back then. But that's all in book 2, and it comes back again a little bit in book 3. So when I was a profiler. So yeah, it's been an interesting life. And like I said, I was kind of content in retirement, working a few gigs with my company. And someone said, you should write these stories down. You're a good writer, Fitz. And I knew the miniseries was coming up, so the timing was just right. And I'm proud of the miniseries, proud of my books. And if anyone's interested in listening to this, be glad to send you a signed copy if you contact me, and we'll take it from there.
Awesome. You also do some training, I see, tied in with universities. Hopefully you guys offer it online for those of us who are not in the area.
Yeah, I'm adjunct faculty at California University of Pennsylvania, and you go into their forensics department, go online and look it up. And I have a 5-hour course in forensic linguistics you can do online. You can check that out. once a year, I'm at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York, right outside of New York City, and I do a 1-week course in forensic linguistics. I co-teach it with my good friend, Professor Rob Leonard, who, a little trivia question, he's one of the founding members of the band Sha Na Na. And now he is a forensic linguist. We're good friends, and my kids think he's so cool because he's a rock star. His kids think I'm so cool. I'm an FBI profiler, and when we all get together, it's a fun. His kids ignore him and want to talk to me. My kids ignore me, want to talk to him. So I guess it's all relative in life. But I take forensic linguistics very serious. I do go around the country online, and I still do training in that area to law enforcement and others so interested. So. So I'm a busy guy, even in retirement, and I don't plan on slowing down anytime soon.
Well, hey, that's obvious. And Jim, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time with us.
You're welcome, Eric. And let's do this again sometime.
Sounds great.
Hi, I'm Tyson Franklin, the host of It's No Secret with Dr. T, which is a small business and marketing podcast. Each week, I interview business leaders who openly share the secrets to the massive success. It's No Secret with Dr. T will educate, entertain, and inspire you. Check it out. You'll find it wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can go to my website, tysonfranklin.com.
I did not grow up with very much money.
Money's energy.
Money is something that really scares me. You had about 60 grand in debt.
Money isn't the answer.
Somebody should just give me a lot of money.
My dream was to be the WWE wrestler, but you realize that your dreams change over the years.
Money is a tool. It's a key to a gate. And at the other side of the gate is the things that you really want to do with your life. It's the things that matter most to you. It's pursuing those values that make you ultimately happy.
Listen to Inspired Money at inspiredmoney.fm.